Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is all about the visualization step of post-processing. There's a big request from my last video. Everybody wanted a little bit more clarification on the visualization in the digital darkroom of getting from A to Z in a edit like the one that I showed you, but not necessarily the editing steps, more so just the thought process and the overall just kind of mindset to put yourself in to get there. So I wanted to make a quick video and share with you guys one of my favorite images and kind of walk you through the thoughts that I have, I guess, had at this point in preparing this image and creating the final edit that I shared with you all. Let's go ahead and jump into this. So right up front, you're going to notice that this image isn't much different from the one that we were post-processing in my previous processing video. The image has been exposed to the right to account for the brightness of the sun and make sure we keep all the details here in the clouds. And the subject is fairly dark over here on the left. But again, we're going to be dual processing these images, so that's okay. I've also shot this in a bracketed sequence because shooting directly into the sunlight, I was able to get a few frames off relatively quickly. So I bracketed it just to make sure that I had all the data in the digital darkroom that I might possibly need. When I take a step back and look at this and I first sit down with the image, I'm trying to guide myself with a frame of reference. And what I mean by that is think back to how you created the composition. Put yourself back on location, recall the photographic vision that you had on scene, and use it as your guide. Ask yourself what you visualized and how you can bring that back into your edit. Ask yourself what is contributing to the photo, what's taking away from it. You have to define your subject and then determine what tools you are going to use to guide the viewer to that subject and ultimately define the subject clearly. Think subject and supports. What is your subject and what are you trying to say about it and what supports that? You need these essential elements in order for the final image to make sense. And when I'm looking at these different elements, I know right away my subject is obviously the lighthouse. Oh, let me go ahead and put this on a different layer actually so we can take these on and off. My subject is obviously the lighthouse. Defined leading line right out to the sunrise. Everything goes from left to right and very clear, obvious composition. I'm going to look around at the edges. I'm going to look at the top corners. I'm going to look all over the image and just kind of take a minute to pick it apart and think, what is it about the image, if anything, that really stands out or really takes away? And honestly, I don't really see much because it's a fairly simple composition. There's really nothing here around the edges. It's just the peninsula with this lighthouse on it jutting out into Lake Superior. So really nothing jumps out at me here. Moving forward from that piece, I want to start approaching this in that digital darkroom mentality. And what I mean by that is I come into this mindset of zones, tones, contrast, and color, specifically in that order. Just a side note, there's really no predefined order that you absolutely have to follow when you're developing in the darkroom, but that's the method that I use that has proven to be effective for me. So in this particular case, I'm going to look at this image based on zones. So I'm going to start, we're going to use Lumenzia for an example here. In zone 0, being our darkest areas, our subject is in those dark areas. We already knew that, but we know that this is the darkest area of the scene with a little bit up here in the clouds. We're going to go to zone 5, try to locate and identify our midtones, which, not surprisingly, are mostly up here in the sky. We're going to come over here to zone 10, and of course, the sunrise is going to be the brightest part of the image as it was designed that way out in the field. So once I have this all laid out and I have an idea of where my zones are falling, I need to then determine how I'm going to blend this all together. looking at this, I know that the tonal range here needs to come up. So considering tones, I want to go ahead and bring this area up probably by about 2 stops. Maybe reduce this area by around 1. Take this area down by about a half because we don't really want a lot of obvious attention going here. There's really nothing going on. But the big thing that I'm noticing is my eye is immediately drawn to this sunrise because it's the brightest and warmest part of the scene. So in any image, you're naturally going to be attracted to the brightest, warmest area. And where my eye goes first is really what I'm trying to calculate here and figure out how I can balance this out. Because obviously my lighthouse over here is the subject. So I need to blend this lighthouse and the sunrise together in a way that's not only cohesive, but also complementary so that one isn't necessarily overpowering the other, but it makes sense that they're on the same plane and that the subject remains this lighthouse. So looking at this, we know we want to bring this area up by 2 stops, reduce this by about a half stop, maybe reduce the sunrise down by about 1 stop or so, and then kind of take a step back from that point and think about what comes next. So had I gone through and done all that here, we would have something that looks more like this. You can see there's really not any massive changes between this image and this image outside of bringing back this area and doing so with a layer mask. So this is dual processing this image. Now that I've brought myself to this step, now I'm going to start thinking in contrast in colors. I've brought the zones together. I've brought the tones together. There's no obvious halos. We're looking pretty good. Everything is fairly well balanced across this image. So now I want to think, what do I need to do for contrast in color to bring this image home? Well, I know already that I want to bring this down by about a stop, but I also want to add some slight contrast right in here. I want to bring the lighthouse up by probably 1.5 stops and add some contrast. I want to add mostly contrast from here to here. So we'll do contrast, and then honestly, we'll probably bring it up by a half stop, maybe 3/4 of a stop through this region. But what I'm really thinking is going to pose a challenge here is this being closer to the sunrise. We obviously have more light over here, so we'll probably have to do a blend of some kind. So I'd probably split this into regions like this, and using a brush set to say 50% opacity, I'd brighten this side up by 3/4, maybe this side up by 1/4, and then start at 50% opacity and then taper down to 40, 30, 20 for each region through here to really bring that difference in adjustments into one another and blend it well. From there, I'm really just kind of looking at the overall image and thinking to myself, what else could I do to balance this? I'm going to go ahead and turn this off and turn another on. I see that I need contrast in my sky. So we want contrast up here through this whole region because this is where all of our midtones are living in this section of the sky. So I want to go ahead and bring some contrast in there. And remember, again, contrast is always going to be more apparent the closer things are to the camera. So we want our contrast close to the camera. We don't want contrast out on some distant mountain back here and have it be super sharp and just perfectly crisp and contrasty. You don't want that. You want your subject to have contrast on it. You want your sky to have good contrast, but you don't necessarily want contrast all over the place. It's going to make the image look crazy. In this particular image, most of the image is sky and subject. So There's an exception to every rule. Like I mentioned earlier, there's no predefined way, there's no perfect way, and every image is going to be different. So when we're looking at this, we know that we need to add some contrast here and add some contrast in the sky. Once we've added contrast into these regions, we also simultaneously want to be adding color. You want to start paying attention to color and contrast. What I mean by that is this, whoops, let me make that a little bit more straight. This region here is going to be a localized edit for color and contrast. This entire region in here on the peninsula is going to be a localized region for color and contrast. Same with the sky up here. We're going to begin making local edits for color and contrast at this point. Generally, add a little bit of color and a little bit of contrast to the image and then see how they work together. You have to look at that relationship and really kind of take a second to just let it sink in and reflect on it, because adding contrast is essential to the final product, but you want to make sure it's balanced. That contrast is going to help us emphasize depth and dimension of the overall image, so we don't want our shadows to be crunched all the way down to pure black, but we don't want our highlights blasted all the way up to pure white either. So doing these more localized edits, you can do that. This down here would probably be a more local edit where we're going to actually take a little bit of contrast out, and then we're going to maybe, like I said, plus or minus one stop, maybe a half stop. And then over here, do a little bit of contrast and maybe minus one stop, and then this will be local edit as well. But that leaves the sky being its own local edit where we're going to do contrast, maybe brighten up a little bit over in this region. So I should have really put the half over here. Brighten that up by a half. Maybe bring this region in by, get rid of that, by a quarter, and then just leave this at 0 and then bring this down by maybe a quarter. And then just be mindful, we want to be adding contrast to each one of those areas as we go through. And that's really what you want to be looking for when you get to color and contrast, guys. We want to be making all these local edits and blending them appropriately to arrive here, the final edit. You can see that all the adjustments that we outlined in the previous step here have been made, and we've singled out the lighthouse. We've adjusted the contrast and the color in the sky. We've reduced the darkness here in the foreground and reduced the brightness of the sunrise just enough to where it balances out nicely with the rest of the image. You can see here, it's pretty bright. All things considered, it definitely could be reduced some. And over here, it's been reduced. It blends in more with the midtones in the top part of the image, and just overall really kind of completes the edit when you're looking at the overall photo. Starting from left to right, we're starting with our subject, the lighthouse, and then kind of being guided right into this beautiful sunrise that's happening right in front of it. That's really all it is, guys, is just starting here and being able to recognize that you're going to need to dual process. You're going to need to make a few changes, and then coming in here and breaking the image out into local adjustments, doing your adjustment down here for your dual processing, or bringing in two bracketed images and blending them together, and then making these different regions for the local adjustments. And then once that's completed, you end up with your final shot, and you can make your final adjustments from there. Again, with any type of artistic effects that you might want to add, or any type of final little tweaks to contrast or color. But Just keep in mind that as you're working on the contrast and the color of the image, that they're going hand in hand, and you need to make sure that you're balancing them throughout your edit. And ultimately, once all is said and done, you'll end up with something similar to that. But that's really it, guys. That is my thought process. That's my editing process in these situations, in these edits, and kind of how I take an image from straight out of camera to sharing with you guys on either my website or social media or whatever the case may be. I will be coming back in 2 weeks with another video and a new studio. I'm going to be making some changes in here, and I'm really excited about it. So it might not all be done by the next video, but we'll see. I'm hoping. Fingers crossed. But until then, we'll see you guys soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.